Just moments ago, inside the walls of Bagshot Park, Prince Edward's hands trembled as he held a document buried for decades. A sealed clause deliberately hidden in the Queen Mother's will mentions one name. Not his, not Charles, not Anne's, but Louise. And what it said threatens to disrupt everything we thought we knew about the royal line of trust, succession, and inheritance. Why was it hidden, and why now? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with an envelope, simple, aged, and stamped with a fading crest delivered not through standard royal channels, but via a discreet courier whose name was never logged. The handwriting was unmistakable, the Queen Mother's, sharp and formal, commanding yet personal, for his eyes only. But Edward, resigned to the periphery of royal decision-making, hesitated. For decades he had played the role of the dutiful son, the quiet brother, the invisible supporter. But inside this package lay something that shattered that role forever. Nestled between legal parchments and aged paper was a clause, unseen by the public, buried behind layers of legal codicils intentionally placed beyond reach, unless a certain unnamed threshold was crossed. That threshold, it seemed, had just been met. The clause didn't merely reference Lady Louise, it centered her. Written in elegant yet assertive prose, it spoke of a legacy bearer, a preserver of bloodline integrity, and a young soul destined to shield the crown from diluted intent. The message was unmistakable. The Queen Mother had named Louise, Edward's daughter, as a pivotal heir not in title but in trust, spirit, and guardianship. The shock hit Edward like a thunderclap. This wasn't a sentimental note or poetic flattery. It was a directive clear, deliberate, and alarmingly incompatible with the current course of the monarchy, one shaped by Charles, dominated by Camilla, and tightly controlled by advisors keen to solidify a certain image of the future. Edward's thoughts spiraled. How long had this clause been hidden? Who had known about it? Why had no one told him? His first instinct was disbelief. He questioned the document's authenticity, checked seals, signatures, watermarks, every forensic hint that might indicate forgery or manipulation. But it was real as the Queen Mother's disdain for disruption and her ferocious love for legacy. She had seen something in Louise that none of them had acknowledged publicly. And now, that unspoken vision was being hurled to the forefront, legally bound and impossible to ignore. The deeper Edward read, the heavier the betrayal felt, not because of what the Queen Mother had written, but because of what had been concealed from him. He, the most dutiful of the royal siblings, had been left in the dark, all while decisions, strategies, and allegiances were formed behind closed doors. The clause even contradicted long-held assumptions, subtly undermining Camilla's growing influence and Charles's passive complicity. And now that it was uncovered, it couldn't simply be reburied. Not without consequences, not without a reckoning. But this wasn't just a legal oddity. It was a time bomb planted in the very foundation of the monarchy, and its ticking had only just begun. Long believed to be a figure of tradition and grace, the Queen Mother carried secrets only a chosen few ever knew. Behind her smiling portraits and ceremonial appearances, a secret pact was forged, one that would bypass generations and place power into hands many never expected. What drove her to name Louise? Beneath the public persona of royal warmth and diplomatic charm, the Queen Mother harbored a private code built on one unwavering principle: the preservation of the bloodline. Those closest to her, including chambermaids, private secretaries, and the rare confidant, often whispered about her obsession with what she called bloodline purity. To her, the crown was not merely an institution of pomp, but a sacred duty tied irrevocably to heritage, to legacy untainted by scandal or convenience. And it was this obsession that quietly placed her at odds with the direction the monarchy was beginning to take in the late 20th century. While the world shifted toward modernity, she remained rooted in the old codes, unbending, immovable, and fiercely protective. In the shadows of Windsor corridors, her discontent with Camilla's growing proximity to Charles began as a cold unease and evolved into outright resistance. Private encounters between the Queen Mother and senior aides in the 1980s and 90s have since been recounted by palace insiders, revealing her sharp criticism of what she termed dilutions of duty. Camilla, in her eyes, symbolized not only a disruption of marital vows, but a betrayal of royal lineage. The Queen Mother had hoped Charles would restore dignity to the crown through a match she could champion. What she got instead, he saw as a slow unravelling of legacy, but everything changed with the birth of Louise. From the moment she laid eyes on the infant wrapped in royal linen, something stirred within her. Perhaps it was the glint of determination in the child's gaze, or the quiet strength she sensed, a rare purity untouched by scandal, shielded from the public chaos engulfing the Windsors. It was then that the Queen Mother began drafting letters handwritten, folded into silk-lined envelopes expressing a startling depth of affection for the girl barely out of the crib. She called her the anchor, the stillness in the storm, and in one cryptic note, the daughter I never had, yet always imagined. Legal advisers close to the Queen Mother were discreetly summoned. A clause was penned, its language specific yet coded with royal nuance. It would remain buried, sealed under legal lock, unless two conditions were met: Lady Louise's coming of age, or a decisive action by Prince Edward that challenged the established line. Either would trigger its release. Those entrusted with the clause were bound by non-disclosure agreements so ironclad they rivaled state secrets. And yet, not all remained within the walls of the palace. Whispers followed some advisers into early retirement, others quietly relocated, and one reportedly vanished from public life, altogether his name erased from royal ledgers. This wasn't a mere sentiment tucked into a will, it was a strategic insertion, a monarch's final hand played from beyond the grave, a move that would remain dormant for decades, until the right moment cracked open its intent. And now, as Edward unravels the layers of what his mother left behind, the emotional weight of that clause is only just beginning to sink in. But even the Queen Mother couldn't predict how that clause would tear open a fault line beneath the royal family. As word of the clause reached Clarence House, chaos erupted. Camilla, blindsided and furious, allegedly confronted Charles behind closed doors. Sources report raised voices, slammed doors, and a single damning question from Camilla: "Did you know about this?" The royal power balance just tilted, and it tilted away from her. From the moment the document surfaced, Camilla's composure began to fracture. For years she had navigated the palace halls with calculated grace, gradually expanding her influence in subtle yet deliberate strokes. Staff placements, ceremonial appearances, access to archives, each move had been part of a carefully built strategy. But this clause was not just unexpected, it was corrosive. It cut through every plan she had made for her family's legacy. Behind the scenes, whispers among aides described Camilla's state as volcanic. She felt blindsided, not only by the clause itself, but by the realization that others might have known and chosen to stay silent. The shock wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Tension within the palace staff reached boiling point. Leaks began seeping through tightly controlled channels. A senior butler, long considered loyal to Clarence House, allegedly confirmed that Camilla had expressed private concern over Louise's increasing public visibility. While Louise remained largely absent from media coverage, her rare appearances drew admiration for their authenticity, a trait the Queen Mother had long valued. Camilla, who had worked tirelessly to shape a modern image for the monarchy, saw in Louise a quiet yet potent challenge, and now that challenge was legally backed by a royal directive from beyond the grave. What stunned observers most, however, wasn't Camilla's reaction, it was Charles's response. For a man known to avoid direct confrontation, his silence in the face of his wife's fury was telling. Some insiders suggest Charles had been made aware of the clause years ago, but dismissed it as ceremonial, never truly believing it would resurface with any consequence. Now, with the monarchy already under a microscope and parliamentary whispers growing louder, he found himself standing between two opposing legacies, the one his mother had left behind, and the one his wife was attempting to build. Palace insiders began leaking Camilla's intentions in the months leading up to the clause's discovery. Private conversations hinted at long-term plans to gradually position her grandchildren into the folds of royal public service, giving them titles, roles, and trust visibility. The Queen Mother's clause didn't just halt that trajectory, it obliterated its credibility. With Parliament already questioning hereditary titles, the notion of bypassing Louise in favour of Camilla's descendants now appeared deeply controversial. Senior courtiers began pulling back. Invitations were rescinded. Eyes once fixed on Camilla now turned toward Louise, and the palace's air grew thick with uncertainty. In response, Clarence House scrambled into damage control. Emergency PR sessions were called at dusk. Senior advisors met behind locked doors, debating whether to confront the clause directly or bury it beneath protocol. But the problem wasn't just, ticks. It was lineage, loyalty, and legacy, converging all at once. And while the public remained unaware of the full scale, the palace knew the storm had only just begun. But what Camilla didn't know was that this clause wasn't just about inheritance. It was about a promise made in secret decades ago. She never asked for the spotlight. Lady Louise Windsor, often overlooked by tabloids and bypassed in succession chatter, may now hold the key to the monarchy's quiet future. But what kind of burden is that being chosen in silence, raised in the shadows, and now expected to rise? From the moment she was born, Louise was wrapped not in the expectations of grandeur, but in the cocoon of obscurity. Shielded from the harsh glow of royal press cycles, she grew up without the entitlement that followed her cousins, without the constant performance that shaped other heirs. Her parents, Edward and Sophie, deliberately carved out a life of understated dignity for her, choosing duty over drama, protection over prominence. But behind palace doors, it wasn't just her parents watching over her. It was the Queen Mother. According to now unsealed correspondences and confidential staff testimonies, Louise's name was frequently spoken in hushed tones in the Queen Mother's wing. Her nursery, they said, was visited more often than any other. The Queen Mother would sit quietly, observing her, speaking to her not as a child of royal blood, but as something far more consequential, an heir of soul, not title. Academically gifted and remarkably grounded, Louise was never seduced by the prestige of her lineage. Tutors described her as fiercely intelligent, with a deep interest in royal history, particularly the lives of those who walked behind the crown, not in front of it. But within that humility burned an inner fire, one that the Queen Mother clearly recognized. An old, nearly forgotten diary entry from a royal nanny recently surfaced, describing a moment when the Queen Mother gazed down at baby Louise and whispered, "This one will carry more than they know. She has it." No one understood what it was then. They do now. The clause didn't crown Louise or thrust her into constitutional succession. It did something far more disruptive. It named her steward of legacy assets, a title that holds no formal position but immense symbolic power. It grants her access, oversight, and influence over royal trusts and foundations linked directly to the Queen Mother's personal estate, making her a quiet force with the ability to shift influence behind the scenes. More than that, it paints a target on her back, because the very moment Edward uncovered the clause, so did Louise. Palace insiders confirm she was informed the same day, and while the world carried on unaware, inside the private quarters of Bagshot Park, she wept. Not out of fear, but because she finally understood why she was always watched, always protected, always held apart. That breakdown wasn't weakness. It was the first tremor of awakening. For decades, Louise had been allowed to be invisible. That luxury has now been revoked. The Queen Mother didn't choose her to rule with a crown, she chose her to protect the soul of the monarchy, and in doing so, set Louise on a path filled with hidden daggers, whispered allegiances, and burdens she never asked for but now must bear with quiet strength. But while one young royal quietly rises, others feel the walls closing in, and one prince is about to explode. When Charles first read the Queen Mother's final draft, he dismissed the clause as symbolic. Now, with the clause legally binding and public whispers growing louder, a weight descends upon him. Sources say he hasn't slept in days, pacing the corridors of Sandringham, muttering one name, Louise. It had been years ago, quiet, unremarkable, when Charles was first shown a preliminary version of the Queen Mother's will. Advisers gathered in the drawing room, sifting through drafts of legal documentation, most of it procedural, ceremonial. Buried within the text was the clause, a single page, oddly worded, and to Charles, deeply outdated. He remembered furrowing his brow, remarking that it felt like something plucked from the Victorian era, not the future-facing monarchy he had hoped to shape. He'd assumed it would be revised out by the final draft, quietly struck in favor of something more palatable to modern optics. It wasn't. And now that miscalculation threatens to haunt every breath of his reign. The conflict inside Charles is not new, but it's now unbearable. He stands trapped between two thrones. One belongs to his mother, whose legacy he has always fought to honor, a legacy of duty, lineage, and stoic endurance. The other belongs to the woman who fought beside him when the world turned its back, Camilla, whose ascension to queen consort was already hard-won and heavily scrutinized. The clause, however, does not serve both. It serves the former, and in doing so, unravels the delicate balance Charles has spent decades stitching together. Behind closed doors, the tension with Edward reach a breaking point. Eyewitnesses claim the brothers exchanged sharp words during an unannounced visit to Windsor. Edward, driven by paternal fury and long-simmering frustration, confronted Charles with a rare edge. "She was your grandmother too," he reportedly snapped, invoking the Queen Mother's memory with a sting of accusation. Charles, visibly shaken, did not respond immediately. For all the power he commands as king, in that moment, he stood as a son cornered by the choices of those who came before him and the consequences he never wanted to face. In desperation, Charles turned to the royal archives. He summoned experts, legal historians and archivists, demanding a line-by-line dissection of the clause's validity. Could it be challenged? Could it be quietly erased? The answer came back in whispers he didn't want to hear. No. The clause, buried in legacy trusts and binding codicils, was fireproof. Its language had been reinforced by the Queen Mother's own legal team. What Charles once saw as poetic tradition was, in fact, intentional law. And now, with its public emergence drawing attention, silence would no longer shield him. He fears deeply that the clause will fracture his final act as monarch, that instead of being remembered for stabilizing the crown, he'll be haunted by the ghost of a woman who reached from the grave to remind him that legacy is not something one modernizes, it's something one protects. And in that haunting, Louise rises. But Charles isn't the only one spiraling, because Prince Edward is no longer content to stay in the shadows. For decades, Prince Edward was the loyal royal, the one who never stirred trouble. But the Queen Mother's clause shattered his calm exterior. Now, after years of watching others ascend, Edward is stepping forward, and this time he's doing it for his daughter. Throughout his life, Edward played the part expected of him, a figure of quiet consistency in a family defined by turbulence. While his siblings courted headlines, Edward stayed behind the curtain, managing his duties without spectacle or scandal. But what the public never saw was the slow erosion of recognition. Time and again he was passed over, excluded from the major conversations, sidelined from decisions that shaped the monarchy's direction. Though he never publicly objected behind palace walls, that exclusion left bruises. The Queen Mother had noticed. And now, through the clause that named Louise not just as a custodian of legacy, but as a signal of Edward's rightful place, she had vindicated him in death. The revelation reignited something dormant within him. Gone was the passive, accommodating prince. In his place stood a father fueled by purpose and fury. The confrontation with Charles was inevitable. Sources describe a heated exchange in the royal library, a room that had once echoed with their childhood, laughter, now laced with accusation and disbelief. Edward demanded to know how long Charles had been aware of the clause, and why, if he had seen the document, he had said nothing. Charles, cornered, offered only fragments of justification, insisting he had thought the clause was symbolic, non-binding. But Edward wasn't buying it. Not anymore. Behind the scenes, Edward began quietly assembling a legal team. He was no longer willing to play along with royal silence. If the monarchy was to pretend the clause did not exist, he would make sure the world knew otherwise. Lawyers were consulted, terms dissected, every inch of the Queen Mother's language was studied like scripture. Edward wasn't planning a coup, but he was preparing to force a reckoning. His daughter's her safety, her right to be seen for what she was chosen, was no longer negotiable. And through it all, Sophie stood at his side. The scene between them in the private quarters of Bagshot Park was one of raw honesty. For years, she had urged Edward to pick his battles wisely, to stay the course, to avoid conflict. But this time was different. When Edward confessed he might go public, might defy the palace machine for the sake of their child, Sophie didn't stop him. She nodded, and then quietly she said, "She's strong, but she needs to know you'll fight for her." That was all the permission he needed. The man once content to live in the monarchy's quiet corners was now at the centre of its greatest storm. His voice, long muted, was rising. The Queen Mother had given him more than a clause, she had handed him a cause. And Edward was ready to act. But just as Edward prepares to reveal everything to the public, a long-buried letter emerges, and it changes everything. In an envelope marked for Edward, should doubt arise. A letter in the Queen Mother's own handwriting paints a chilling portrait of palace machinations. Her final words, "Protect Louise. They'll come for her." With this revelation, the stakes go beyond inheritance, they become a matter of royal survival. It arrived quietly, almost too quietly. A leather-bound portfolio, delivered not by a courier or advisor, but discovered among the Queen Mother's private effects items, once deemed sentimental and filed away, untouched for years. The envelope had remained sealed, locked in a personal box archived by a trusted member of her household who had followed her final instruction with exacting loyalty. It was only an activation of the clause, the very clause now shaking the walls of the monarchy that the conditions were met. The contents, handwritten in delicate cursive and laced with an unmistakable tone of finality, were meant for one person alone, Edward. The letter was more than a farewell. It was a warning, a prophetic voice from the grave that stripped away the polished veneer of royal unity and exposed the rot beneath. The Queen Mother's words were raw, urgent, and haunting. She spoke of betrayals cloaked in courtesy, of hands that once kissed hers plotting a future she could not bear to witness. She referenced unnamed royal senior, influential who, in her words, would trade legacy for image and crown for convenience. Her fear wasn't just about what might happen to the monarchy, it was who might redefine it entirely if left unchecked. At the centre of her fear was Louise, not just as a granddaughter, but as a symbol of restraint, of tradition, of everything the Queen Mother believed the crown should protect. The letter described Louise as the last child untouched by ambition, a quiet soul destined not to rule but to guard. Then came the line that turned Edward's blood cold: Louise must never sit beside Camilla's heirs. It was a direct condemnation, one that tore open the decades-long conflict the Queen Mother had buried, behind smiles and royal grace. She had not just disapproved of Camilla's presence, she feared what it represented. And she had seen, even then, the outline of a battle that would one day unfold between two very different visions of royal continuity. For Edward, the letter shattered any remaining doubt. The clause was no accident, no relic of romanticized tradition. It was strategy. A final move by a woman who understood how deeply power could be disguised as politeness. And now, that burden had passed to him. No longer was this about restoring a rightful place or standing up for his daughter. It had become a mission to uphold the final will of the one matriarch who had always seen beyond titles and politics. The Queen Mother had known that enemies wouldn't come with weapons, but with smiles, influence, and quiet edits to the future. And now that the truth was fully illuminated, Edward felt the weight of her trust crash into him like a tidal wave. He wasn't just fighting for Louise anymore. He was fighting for the monarchy she believed was worth saving. But if Edward thought he could quietly assert this legacy, he underestimated just how far Camilla's camp was willing to go. Behind palace walls, Camilla's team is already mobilizing. Legal loopholes, reputation management, anonymous leaks. This isn't just a will dispute, it's a war for legacy. and Camilla knows that to preserve her line's influence, Lady Louise must be stopped before the people rally behind her. Within hours of the clause surfacing, a private crisis team was assembled at Clarence House. Not the usual press advisors or ceremonial aides, but legal tacticians, former intelligence consultants and communications operatives trained to dismantle threats before they bloomed. Camilla was not simply reacting, she was launching a counter-offensive. This clause, if left unchallenged, would not only elevate Lady Louise into the public's imagination as a symbol of continuity and grace, it would cast Camilla as the antithesis. And, in a monarchy built on image, that shift could be fatal to everything she had orchestrated over the years. Her legal team began combing through the Queen Mother's estate filings, hoping to find inconsistencies, ambiguities, any technical oversight that could invalidate or at least delay the clause's execution. But it didn't stop with paperwork. Whispers began circulating in private circles about Camilla's interest in old dossiers files that delved into Edward and Sophie's past. Former associates were quietly contacted. Inquiries were made into long-forgotten decisions, remarks, even moments of parental misstep. The implication was clear: if they couldn't eliminate the clause, they'd cloud the legitimacy of those it protected. Meanwhile, sympathetic media channels subtly pivoted the narrative. Articles surfaced questioning Louise's readiness. Was she too quiet? Too removed from the public eye? Could someone so inexperienced possibly handle the symbolic responsibility the clause hinted at? It was a strategic erosion, one doubt at a time. Internally, Camilla made another bold move. She allegedly approached Prince William not with a direct request, but with veiled logic. Unity, stability, continuity phrases wrapped in concern but steeped in agenda. The implication was simple: support the clause, and the institution fractures. Push it aside, and the public outcry is manageable. But William, caught between generations and legacies, gave no response. His silence only deepened the tension. Camilla, however, took it as resistance. And in response, her circle began planting seeds that the Queen Mother's clarity of mind in her final years was questionable at best. Anonymously sourced leaks hinted at memory lapses, fragmented thoughts, and the possibility that this clause, this so-called legacy, was the product of confusion, not intention. Through all of this, Buckingham Palace offered nothing. No statements, no clarifications. The silence was deafening, and yet it spoke volumes. Without a firm denial, speculation thrived. The press latched on. Historians weighed in. The country began to fracture into factions, those who believed the clause was destiny, and those who saw it as disruption. But for Camilla, it was survival. If she lost control now, everything she had built, every inch of legitimacy she had clawed for, would begin to unravel. The battle was no longer behind closed doors. It had spilled into the bloodstream of the monarchy itself. But even as battle lines are drawn and secrets turn to strategy, nothing could prepare the family for what would happen next. In a moment neither planned nor expected, Lady Louise steps before a quiet press gallery and speaks not as a child of royalty, but as a woman of duty. Her words are steady, piercing, and unforgettable, and as her voice echoes across Britain, one thing becomes clear: a new royal era may have just begun. No fanfare, no prepared address, no royal handlers guiding her words. Louise stepped forward on instinct, not instruction. The press had been summoned for a routine charity appearance, but what followed was anything but ordinary. She stood behind the microphone, face composed but eyes burning with something deeper resolve. With the weight of a clause that once belonged to a grandmother she barely remembered, and a storm swirling around her name, Louise chose to speak not to claim a throne, but to defend a legacy. In her opening, she honoured the Queen Mother, not in the polished way palace statements often do, but with reverence laced with emotion. She acknowledged the clause, confirmed its existence, and admitted that it had changed everything. But then, with the steadiness of someone twice her age, she did the unthinkable. She rejected the idea of challenge. "This is not about taking something that was never mine," she said. "It is about protecting what was always hers." That single line detonated across every news cycle in the country. It wasn't rebellion, it was responsibility. And that distinction shifted public opinion in a heartbeat. Social media erupted. The hashtag Louise Rising trended within minutes, not just in the UK but globally. News anchors abandoned scripts. Commentators called it the most composed royal appearance since Diana's famous BBC interview. But this wasn't scandal, it was structure. Louise hadn't undermined the monarchy. She had fortified it, proving to the world that strength could come in silence and leadership in restraint. Even critics who had once questioned her relevance were forced to reconsider. She had become something the monarchy had sorely lacked: authenticity. Behind the scenes, the ripple effect was more seismic. Parliamentarians who had remained neutral began discussing the symbolism of her words. Some floated the idea that perhaps titles and lines of succession needed revisiting, not to elevate Louise, but to ensure that individuals like her had roles in shaping the crown's moral compass. The clause may have named her steward of legacy assets, but now the public was calling her something greater: the monarchy's moral heir. And somewhere, away from the lashing cameras and thunderous applause, King Charles stood alone, watching the statement in silence. Those close to him say he didn't speak for several minutes. And then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "She is her great-grandmother's heir, not just by blood but by purpose." In that instant he knew that everything was different. The future hadn't arrived with noise, it had arrived with dignity. And so, with one hidden clause, one determined father, and one rising daughter, the royal family may never be the same again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.